Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Liminal Space. I'm really excited to share this episode with you today in discussion with Tyson Yunkaporta. Tyson is a member of the Apalech Clan in far north Queensland in Australia, and is also a senior lecturer in Indigenous knowledges at Deakin University in Melbourne. He's worked extensively with Aboriginal languages and in Indigenous education, and his research activities include oral histories of natural disasters, language, health, and cognition. Tyson has recently released a new book called Sand Talk: How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, which is making a huge impact right around the globe. In Sand Talk, Tyson encourages us to look at global systems through an Indigenous lens and challenges us to think differently and reconsider our relationships with each other and the natural world around us. The book is both philosophical and practical, offering techniques and processes for living and learning. It's a book of sense-making, bringing clarity to complexity. It was a real honour to be able to have this chat with Tyson. He's brutally honest, unfiltered, at times confronting, but speaks with an absolute passion and authenticity. Just before we begin, if you'd like to see more of these episodes, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell button below, like and share this video, and leave any comments or questions below. But for now, buckle up as we enter a liminal space with Tyson Yunkaporta. You're in for quite a ride. Hi Tyson, and welcome to a liminal space.
Yeah, it's pretty damn liminal.
It's liminal. Well, I know time is very precious. You've had to get yourself out of the house to find some quiet time, so I really appreciate you taking the time to have a chat.
Yeah. There's kids everywhere all the time. But that's just life.
That's life. So Let's get stuck into it. I've just finished reading your book, Sand Talk: How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, and what a book!
How'd you go?
Yeah, well, it blew my mind on many levels, and I was half reading it and half studying it in a sense, taking lots of notes as I went, and it was super interesting. For those that haven't read the book, and I absolutely encourage everyone to get out there and grab it, can you give us an idea as to sort of what was your intention in writing the book and the main messages that you wanted to get out?
Yeah, well, I guess it's kind of a delivery system for Old Man Juma's stuff mostly. A number of sort of messages and tasks that elders have given me over the years, to do out in the world. But particularly Old Man Juma's symbols there. He's sort of, I don't know, it's kind of this big ritual magic. He wanted me to share with as many people as possible by any means possible. He sort of sees it as something that will change people at the molecular level, change people's DNA and, make big change in the world. And, it's, I don't know, when you hear things like that, you're like, yeah, and on one level, but then on another level, you're kind of like, yeah, nah. But it has had a very strange effect on a lot of people all around the world, lots of different kinds of people. And yeah, so I guess that was my intention in doing it, was really just to try and put something together as a delivery system for that. But the areas of interest that I've sort of studied and researched and been working in and writing around for years has kind of been a lot of the stuff that no one else wants to look at. So I don't sort of trespass into other people's lanes. There's a lot of high status scholars and thinkers and elders out in the world who are doing all the cultural awareness kind of side of things and all the stuff that you see with Indigenous knowledge usually. So the stuff that's kind of left over that nobody really wants to look at, that's what I've been looking into, like cognition, consciousness, cybernetics, and just kind of the stuff that's left over. And so I sort of cobbled together a lot of my thinking around that, sort of tied in with how they tied in with all these stories and messages old people wanted me to put into the world. And yeah, so that's what it was.
So it's sort of viewing the current world that we live in through an Indigenous lens. I mean, that's how I would describe it.
Yeah, basically it's almost reverse anthropology. So I think people go in there looking for Indigenous knowledge and wisdom, but that's not what it is, because it's the knowledge is not in the content. It's kind of in the process. It's in the methods of inquiry and the ways of assessing and evaluating and digging around in new knowledge. I guess it's a sense-making mechanism. And that's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of hit the scene at a time when there's a crisis of meaning in the world and people are obsessed with sense-making, across a lot of disciplines, from psychology to tech to all kinds of things. And people are struggling with that a bit. So I guess they've kind of grasped, a lot of people are grasped at this like a drowning man at the moment.
Yeah. And why you?
Yeah.
Why was this sort of asked or requested of you? Or why did you take this space? Or why did you take this upon yourself? Is it because you're experts across those fields, or you don't actually fit into anything and you're able to move across all of these spaces?
I'd like to say I'm a polymath, but I mean, you kind of have to have a certain degree of expertise across a lot of fields before you're a polymath. So I'm not sure what I am.
But is there, in Indigenous culture, if you're asked to do something by an elder, is there sort of a...
Yeah, it's just something that you kind of accept, or you find yourself, on the outside of things pretty quickly,
Yeah.
It's funny like that. Talk a lot about the authority that our old people have, and have a lot of authority. And they don't do a lot of decision making. They kind of leave that to the rest of us, sort of in a distributed and collective way. We do a lot of the decision making, and so power and agency and everything else is kind of spread throughout the community. I mean, ideally,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of times, I mean, there is a lot of dysfunction, etc., that where that actually goes wrong, and you get a lot of hierarchies sort of forming now, around committees and funding and sort of areas like that. I try to stay away from those and sort of, talk to a lot of the people who are still really inhabiting and living that pattern, because that's where I live, in those sections of the community. So you kind of just have to do, when they sort of put that on you, you kind of do that if you sort of ever want to progress, with it within that in sort of any way, and continue to reap the benefits of being part of a supportive community.
Yeah.
A supportive community with a kind of sharing economy where you you're always looking after each other, and therefore you're going to be looked after when you sort of fall low. It's a bit of a safety net,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I find really interesting. The book also, because the book sort of, it's like a self-reflexive text. It talks about the process of writing the book, if that makes sense. So by example, you're actually proving this other perspective or other way of working by telling us how you worked to write this book, in a way.
Yeah.
So it's very practical also, rather than just academic, I would say.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot of like thought experiments.
Exactly.
So applying those processes and those patterns of logic, applying them to some of the messy problems in the world, I don't know, just some interesting ideas about the global financial crisis, and the potential of having, like what might happen if we sort of made a few tweaks in sort of finance and the economy, so that extended families could collectively own capital, rather than that being nominally in the hands of an individual. What if an extended family was able to own capital collectively, and then what that might do for the economy, and what kind of safety nets that would provide, that would take away a lot of problems of the welfare burden and all that kind of thing. It's just applying patterns of Indigenous kinship, thinking, problem solving, everything, sense making, dialogue, all these things, how you might apply those to a lot of the crises that are kind of adding up to a meta crisis right now.
Yeah.
And I guess it was at the time when I wrote it, it was kind of like one of the criticisms in the editing process was kind of like, yeah, but, you're a bit of a Chicken Little. Here, the sky is falling kind of thing. It's things are a lot more stable than that. I don't think, this crisis is, there's going to be a big crisis. It's going to engulf the world, etc. Yeah. But then, by the time it hit the United States, the book, then, there were about 10 crises happening at once, and the world was on fire.
Yeah, it seems to be perfect timing. Seems to be the perfect voice, and in a way, you seem to be the perfect, even though possibly a reluctant person with the microphone or on the podium, let's say, reluctant in the sense that I know you've got other things in your life to do and to spend your time, but it just seems like this is the right time, right place, and you're the right rebel, in a sense, to shake things up. And I thought maybe
I'm not a rebel by choice. I've just got a bunch of colliding marginalities that kind of, put me out of things and sort of give me a sufficiently kind of low status in the academy and in the community and everywhere else that kind of allows me to, I guess, be able to have a perspective on seeing how things work and seeing the processes.
Yeah.
It's like being a fish that's able to sort of jump out of the water and up on the bank for a minute and have a look back in and go, oh, shit, there's water there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean.
And then sort of describe that water. And then, therefore, be able to look at the air and go, oh, how is that different from the water? There's some interesting things going on here. Hey, fellas, we're breathing oxygen, but it's different up here. that kind of thing. Yeah.
Do you mind if I read a couple of sentences from, I think, the second page of the book, and then I thought that would be a way into talking about the content. All humans evolved within complex land-based cultures over deep time to develop a brain with the capacity for over 100 trillion neural connections, of which we now only use a tiny fraction. Most of us have been displaced from these cultures of origin, a global diaspora of refugees, severed not only from land, but from the sheer genius that comes from belonging in symbiotic relation to it. Pretty deep stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot in that. And there's elements of that are quite highly contestable and contested as well, Yeah. And, I've been having those yarns for a year, and it's been really interesting. I mean, there's the kind of pop science idea that, we only use 5% of our brains or whatever, and that's not really true. But that's not really what I'm saying there either.
So what are you saying? What are you saying in that sentence?
Yeah, well, the words were that there's a capacity for trillions of connections, neural connections in the brain, but we're not using many of those. But then the neuroscience would say, well, there's a lot of pruning that goes on. From early childhood, there's a lot of pruning that goes on, and you actually increase your intelligence with quite a bit of that, pruning a lot of those connections, etc. But that's also contested. So
yeah.
but basically, I'm challenging the discourses of primitivism. This idea of pretty much all the disciplines from psychology to economic theory to everything else is predicated on a wrong story of a Paleolithic sort of caveman past. They're prepared to acknowledge that, Cro-Magnon, etc., and cavemen had like a 10% bigger brain than today. But the way they explain that away is that is hypervigilance, and so they build a lot of ideas around this primitive fight or flight responses that, as our reason for being a destructive creature that ruins the world, and we can't help ourselves. We've got to wreck it because we got these fight or flight responses all the time. Because when we were cavemen, anytime you hear a sentence in science that starts with "when we were cavemen," you know that a bit of bullshit that is not supported anywhere by any real research is about to be said. And it's just people fantasy projecting themselves back, like what would happen if they were like dropped like Bear Grylls in the middle of the wilderness? How would they respond? But that's not what Indigenous life is like when it's embedded in the landscape that you're a part of. And that is our Paleolithic past. We don't have fight or flight responses and hypervigilance where we never know when a tiger's going to jump out and eat us, So your brain always has to be switched on. That's why their brains were bigger. Not because they were doing anything intelligent, just because they were shit scared all the time. But the fact is that, you talk to anybody who still has a living memory of being embedded in a landscape, and they will tell you, we always know where the tigers are. We know where the fucking tigers are, bro. Because you do. If you're of that place, you know where the tigers are and what time they're going to be where. You're not walking around scared that they're going to jump out. And on top of that, you also have a relationship with those predators. We all have a relationship with the apex predators in our environment, particularly as human beings. So if you were in North America or Europe, and right across into Asia, there in the old days, you'd have a relationship with the bears. Nobody ever gets eaten by a bear. You follow the bears to see what your diet is and to find the right fungi that are good for you to eat, because the bear has the same diet as humans. Up in the north of Australia, there's no memory of anybody local ever having been eaten by a crocodile, because you know where the crocodiles are, and what's more, you have a relationship with them. So my mob used to tie the hair from the first haircut around a baby crocodile's head and let that one go, and you'd be connected to that crocodile, and that would be your crocodile. And you go swim with that crocodile, hunt fish with that crocodile. There are photos of the men in that community, who would swim out into the river and call their crocodiles and lift the tails up to show the visiting tourists, who'd take photos of that. You have a relationship with the predators.
Yeah.
And to have that deep understanding and embeddedness and that very quantum view of reality and time and place and everything else, within very complex structures that are designed to prevent, excesses of human society from creating imbalances. If you're embedded in that's a lot of thinking to be doing. But then with a very, very rich, ritual tradition and ceremonial practice, and what we separated into the idea of arts and culture now, but used to not have a name. It would just be part of your daily life. Very, very high level meaning making. Even a tradition of riddling. You can find riddles, 300-400-year-old riddles from Gamilaroi country in Gamilaroi language that strangely have a very similar structure to that European riddling tradition. So there are a lot of academic sort of leisure, like intellectual pursuits that were leisure pursuits and that were competitive, and just designed to, increase that cognition all the time and to keep you really sharp. So, we have intellectual traditions, and as human beings, we're all coming from really powerful and very complex intellectual traditions, going back like 1 million years. That's the oldest examples, I think, of abstract symbols being found, created by humans on the planet, like carved shells, etc. Like 1 million years old. We've been doing this for a long time. And the idea that this recent sort of domestication that's happened really over the last 100 years or so, the idea that that's the pinnacle of intelligence and the pinnacle of human development, the pinnacle of progress, the pinnacle of achievement is just...
Are you offended by that notion?
No. That's the thing. It's not about offense. Like that we've got to just to be respectful, we have to appreciate that, Indigenous cultures, we really were quite sophisticated, because that's pretty much all we get now. All the discourse around dark emu, it's just culture wars back and forth on whether or not people were advanced enough to be respected. And, you know, I don't really have any skin in that game. I'm more about, well, we're basing a lot of our disciplines on wrong story. You know, if you're building your psychological models and even your economies out of this idea that human beings are motivated by fight or flight, pleasure pain responses, and that we're monkeys in clothes, that don't have the capacity to be better than we currently are. If you're motivated by that, then basically what that creates is a self-terminating system. You know, if all of your disciplines are based on that foundational self-terminating algorithm, then you will destroy yourselves and everything else, you know, as a species, but particularly as a species that is supposed to be the custodial species of this planet. We are the custodial species, and we have been given all these gifts to be able to do that. Instead, we've sold ourselves a lie and built this idea of game theory out of that, and game theory has informed our economic systems and this social Darwinism that was nothing like what Darwin was actually talking about. And, you know, so we've created this weird society to serve an economy that's based on this magical thinking and this idea that we're just an aggregate of all these self-interested individuals who are kind of, you know, swarming around the place following our own self-interests, and that will dictate what is needed by the marketplace, and that will be the invisible hand that will lift us all up. And you know, but at the same time that we can be manipulated by those primitive fight or flight responses, you know, to do this or that. But in fact, it's just something that we've been trained to do in our domestication over the last century. You know, when we've all been forced into this model of nationhood, because even the idea of nations, you go back a century, and that was not the dominant form of social organization on the planet. You know, that was a baby of an idea back then, a century ago. It was only just over a century ago that even came into existence. You know, before that, we were a very regionalized species. You know, a century ago, most of the people on the planet were still profoundly associated with and dependent on the land, and we're living on the land. It's only over the last century we've created these massive monocultures, these massive nations with millions of people, you know.
And it sounds like you're very much challenging and reclaiming, or attempting to reclaim and supporting others to reclaim stories that, like, wrong stories that were made up by people who were the oppressor, who wanted to make up a narrative that made it very easy to continue to oppress in many ways and continue to separate. And
I think it's kind of, it's interesting, but sort of the Anglosphere, liberalism, all this kind of thing, this global economic system, it's kind of its own complex adaptive system now. So it kind of, you know, for a long time, it's just been self-organizing, and it's been evolving. You know, basically, we set a bunch of, you know, just some bad stories in place, which, you know, were put in place by people, you know, they were just trying something out, I guess, you know, 10,000 years or so ago. But basically, we created a system of perverse incentives that then resulted in this weird set of evolutionary dynamics, you know, that inevitably just kept increasing, growing, snowballing into this massive kind of self-organizing demonic beast, which you know, we call civilization. And it's certainly not the best way to live. That doesn't mean we have to be running around in animal skins and, you know, bashing people over the head with clubs. In fact, that's the wrong story. That's the lie of our past that sort of, has to force us into this. There's a loop. Every time you start thinking about these things, you try not to have that thought come into your head. We can't go back. We can't go back. We have to keep going forward. We have to have progress. So, and that's where we start to get into the physics of time. Like we do some physics thought experiments in the book too, working with Indigenous story and Indigenous, cosmologies, where we kind of look at alternatives to that arrow of time, which sort of demands this continual progress idea that, today is better than yesterday and tomorrow will be better than today. And that's the imperative. We all have to work towards that grand project of continually improving until, we're what? These perfect beings just sort of sitting around, don't have to do anything.
But I think that's
gentlemen of leisure.
That's a beautiful thing.
Gentlemen of leisure.
It's a beautiful thing that you do in the book. You seem to challenge very directly, even this concept of time. You're saying like we have this idea that time is linear, and then you put forward very simple but compelling, not even arguments, but just explaining in your world that nothing should be considered to be fact in a way. Everything is a great is a great mystery. What I've also really been interested in is your more recent idea of sort of smashing the narrative or the stereotype of this kind of, how can I say it, poor Indigenous story or a rags to riches story, perhaps of yourself, that an audience for some years, decades or generations have wanted to know that story of someone rising above, nothing, and now he's writing a book and he's famous. And
the only problem with that is that, to be Aboriginal is to not be an individual, and so you can't have any individual success. I mean, so what could you accumulate that wouldn't immediately dissipate? If you are embedded in a family, an extended family and a community, it's very hard to hold on to anything for yourself. I've started getting a few royalties in from the book, but I just hemorrhage them immediately, because there's so many people who depend on me, so I have to keep doing this job that I don't really like doing, that sort of takes up most of my time, so I've got to try and find, 2 weeks out of every year that people normally have their holidays. That's when I write a book, or do something for myself like that, but that doesn't increase my brand or my market share or my wealth, because that all just goes. There are always funerals and not much money around. There are always funerals. There are occasionally weddings. There are constant, uncle, I need kimbies. I got no nappies for the babies. Help. I'm stuck in Weipa. I got nowhere to stay. Help. So there is no individual success, and nobody really cares, if you get like, so I did get a doctorate, but it doesn't really matter. It matters if I have to write an affidavit, for court, or if I'm have to give someone a reference for a job, and it's helpful to people in that way. That's when it matters, but it doesn't embiggen me. I'm still I'm still a younger sibling, and I'll always be a younger sibling. So I'm always going to be quite low status, even in my family. But then, and in the wider Indigenous community, I'm still, like more than 50% of us, I'm still a fair skinned person. And, so quite marginal from that perspective as well, and I'm also, you see how I talk, I just I can't manage that quiet dignity that knowledge keepers have and that respected sort of people have. So I'm never going to be able to be an elder or a, big knowledge keeper or anything. because I'm too silly, you know. I'm swearing all the time, making jokes, and I like to have fun whenever I can.
But the word that comes to mind, you say it as a negative. I hear you as a refreshing voice. I hear you unbound of limitations. I hear some, maybe I'm wrong, but I got this idea through reading your book, through listening to your interviews, that the opposite, that you actually somehow have been able to understand who Tyson Yunkaporta is and rise above the collective. And it appears to me that you're far less affected by perhaps negative, you know, you don't give a shit is how I get it, of what people say to you and think about you, which is refreshing.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a superpower. It's, I don't know, that just tends to upset people more though. You know, there are a lot of gating functions, you know, for any community sort of living under the blanket of this economic system.
Yeah.
You know, there are, you know, always powerful groups with vested interests. There are always gating functions going on left, right, and center. And you know, it's a tricky place to be. And I guess, you know, most people sort of stay put. I don't know, but that's another thing, you know, that brings around about my marginality is that I tend to just say fuck it more often than not, and that does free you up to a certain extent, like to be able to you know, put together interesting ideas and to you know, combine disciplines. You know, where especially in discipline spaces where you're not expected to be, and then you're combining two or three of them, but then placing that under a lens that is, you know, is not supposed to be looking there. You know, so interesting things come out.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm liberated in my kind of, you know, death wishy way of not really particularly caring about what people think about me. Yeah, that I'm liberated in that way. I don't know. My woman and I were talking about this earlier. That there's a kind of strength that happens in the blows that you take throughout your life. If you have that every blow you take is showing you a chink in your armor, and if you're able to make meaning out of the transgressions against your dignity and all of the shameful things that happen to you, and you get smashed and smashed and smashed. But if you, at each point of impact like that, you're making meaning, then you're not experiencing trauma. All you're experiencing is a sort of a strengthening and an adaptation and a transformation, you know. So I guess I'm basically just a product of abuse, you know, throughout my entire life, a product of just ongoing, continuous abuse that just doesn't bother me, like at all. Yeah, I got bashed up a couple of days ago. I didn't care. It was just like, oh yeah, that's a bit stiff and a couple of bruises for a few days. She right? You know what I mean? It's yeah. I think we're sort of supposed to be, you know, out in the world and getting tested and knowing where our edges are and feeling that rough and tumble, you know. That's why I think a lot of people are attracted to kind of controlled, sort of dangerous, you know, events and rituals and sports and pastimes. It's because we're all longing for that anyway.
Yeah.
So I've never really been too bothered about the rough and tumble. Not since I was about 10 when I stopped talking about it and sort of just went, well, I'm still alive after all this. Still going, a few scars, bit of a limp. I can't hear out of that ear very well, but I'm doing all right. Oh, yeah.
I did hear as well that you made a conscious choice, or maybe perhaps you were advised by elders or people that telling or perpetuating this sort of rags to riches story, or this
The stories of trauma.
The stories of trauma was
Yeah.
actually not moving the whole discussion forward in a productive way.
Yeah, and that was very hard because I used to enjoy, and I did it for a long time. You know, I'd tell all my history and all, you know, this is what my ancestors have gone through, and this is, you know, how I ended up here, and you know, and I'd re-traumatize myself every time, but I kind of enjoyed it. You know, I think we all do, and I don't know, you kind of, there's some kind of social credit you gain from that, or some kind of social capital that you accrue when you do that, when you identify with your misery that is sort of not your fault, that happened to you or whatever, and it's very compelling. But I don't know, I was pulled up really sharply for it, you know, by just a great thinker and a mentor, a scholar from the Torres Strait, who just really slammed me about it. And he said, "You got to stop doing that. We've all got to stop doing that." And he challenged me to find a meta narrative. He said, "Forget about your personal narrative. Yes, you know, people love hearing that. You know, black fellas and white fellas, we love hearing that, going over it again and again, but that's not getting you anywhere. You know, you need to find the meta narrative. You need to find the big story for this world, and you need to tell that story, and you need to work with that and focus your inquiry in that. And stop telling your story, because as soon as you tell it, if you tell it in the first part of a keynote, nobody hears anything else you've got to say in the second half. That's all gone. All they remember is that. And you know, if we're ever going to stop this colonial amnesia from happening, then we're going to have to start coming into the more meta and macro side of things. And you know, look, there's a big market for those stories, and I think, and there's people who deserve to be there telling those stories, and who have that market share of that, and they've, you know, they have a body of work behind them and a lifetime of struggle, you know, and they've earned that place to be there and telling those stories, and they're the right people to be telling them, you know. And not all of us are the right person for that, you know, especially when we're curating these narratives to kind of leave out the parts that make you look like a dickhead. And, you know, about 98% of everything I've done in my life makes me look like a dickhead. So I had to like lose my attachment to trying to curate a story out of that would make me look good, or make me look like, well, yeah, I'm a dickhead, but it's not my fault. That's your fault, or something. And I don't know, I just had to embrace the whole thing and go, this is who I am. I'm a bit of a dickhead. What is it that a dickhead can do? Probably some interesting things. Let's see. Let's see what that produces.
Well, I think the book is absolute testament and example of, you know, it's easier. My own filmmaking has focused in the last years on stories of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and I find many of the themes quite similar. In there is a story that is almost expected to be told by both sides, by the storyteller and by the listener. And each time it's told again, it just reconfirms a stereotype, or it reconfirms a story that, and it puts in a box and a pigeonhole, you know, that's that person and that's that experience, not the individual experience. It's sort of the collective. And, you know, in my opinion, what you've done by writing this book is like literally millions of times more interesting and effective than getting up and telling your sob story, in a sense, or your, you know, and by
or any story. Look, what do you call an author who doesn't have to tell their autobiography at the start of a book? A white male author. Like, you know straight away when you're reading a book, you know, whether it's a dominant culture male writing the book or not. Because if it is, they don't have to tell their story. it's just their experience is known and assumed. And I don't know, I really did enjoy sort of disrupting things a little bit around that. You know, in the end, like my first version of the book, just it had nothing, and it was quite aggressively arrogant around that. It was like, no, these guys don't have to do this, so I'm not going to do it either. But yeah, in the end, it just, yeah, the publishers just went, no, you're going to have to, you're going to have to share some stuff. You know, because you can go a fair amount of a way like that, but you have to tell something. And so I'm like, all right, well, I'll tell the absolute minimum. And then I did. And then I'm getting all these calls from people saying, you know, oh, I just finished, you know, like, yeah. So this Gunditj Mara, you know, woman calls me up, you know, a few weeks back, and she's crying. She's read the first chapter and she's crying, oh, my brother, your story make me cry, you know. And I'm like, that's like, I'm so sick of having to do that. And it's like, yeah, and what else did you notice in that chapter? Oh, well, nothing, you know. And I said some really important things in there about cognition and about the sort of gap between knowledge and print, you know, and the temporary nature of print, and, you know, the problematics of thinking through a print-based kind of cognition. There were some really important things there, and she didn't see any of that. You know, she focused on, like, you know, although I did it quite minimally, you know, the tragic story. And I'm like, not even tragic. It's just silly. Just a silly and shameful story. It's just like, oh, man, well, look, that's who I am. And it's not very good. And I'm sorry, I can't be all noble and stuff for you. And, you know, and basically, you know, most of the crappy things that have happened to me have been my fault. Sorry, I can't be your tragic native or your noble native, or, you know, even your dark native or anything. I'm really, really not the authentic thing to be looking at, you know.
Do you know what I believe you are? I believe you're the authentic thing. You're the authentic individual. And I think it's...
Oh my goodness.
No, in the sense of, really, when I was reading this, it's like, this guy is brave, this guy is really smart, and he's able to produce something that is extremely creative and tell stories in ways to engage us to think about the world differently. Well, that's what I got out of it. I didn't actually get your negative or sad story coming through the book.
Oh, that's good.
I mean,
That's good. Thank you.
You talk about that chapter.
Yeah.
You talk about that chapter. I remember that vividly. It's about, you're saying that it's all about relationships and connectivity and people-to-people relationships in which to pass on wisdom and knowledge.
Yeah. Well, because that idea of the individual, you know, and that we're all on this self-actualizing hero's journey, you know, and that we're all, like, you know, looking inwards and improving ourselves and everything. I don't do that. When I look inside, there's nothing there. And when I look inside other people, I see nothing there too. There's nothing special there. Your mind isn't even inside of you. You know, I mean, it's part of it, and there's a bit that goes on there, but look, all your cognition, all of your thought, all of your memory, it exists in the spaces in between you and the others that you're related to, that you're in relation with and communication with in this world. You know, you're networked out to so many different human and non-human entities. And most importantly, place, you know, where you are all the time, there's this constant flow of knowledge and information and everything, you know. But what is unique and individual is your fingerprint of those relations. Your web of relations is unique, and no one else has it, and nobody else ever has or ever will.
I wanted to ask, for you and for people that haven't read the book, what would be the main difference or differences in the ways of viewing the world in an Indigenous way and in a non-Indigenous way?
Yeah, I think people are focused on different things. You know, there are a lot of similarities and differences, and I argue quite strongly that this idea of the Indigenous way of seeing the world is really just the human way, and that's what we're all hardwired to do from birth, and that we have to be kind of, you know, abused and broken like a wild animal being domesticated, you know, through childhood to kind of knock us out of those ways of thinking, you know. Um, yeah, and I look at some of the studies that have been done on that, the cognitive ones and all that sort of thing. But yeah, some of the one of the main things is just context. Contextual cognition, contextual ways of thinking are how we're pretty much supposed to do things as a species.
Yep.
But in an industrialized human, and somebody who's, you know, had to rewire their brain for print-based, you know, logics without experiencing anything else, it's a very different way of thinking. It focuses, you know, solely on the task in front of you to be done. You know, humans have had to be domesticated into something that would fit into industry. You know, a worker that wouldn't care, you know, wouldn't care what had happened to the object they have to work on at their part of the production line. They wouldn't have to care where that came from, and they wouldn't have to care about what was happening to it next, or how their shift was organized, or all of their workforce was organized, or how their community was organized. That they would do that, and then they would go home to their domicile, and they would accept that as well. You know, it takes a very particular kind of blinkering, you know, of your mind to be able to accept just the horrific abuse that a job places upon a being, you know. And so the kind of cognition you need for that, it changes everybody. And you don't just, you know, so it's not some biological difference in an Aboriginal brain that would make us think in contextual ways. You know, it's actually mostly it's coming from different child rearing practices, you know, being raised in like sort of noisy, dense social environments with lots of adults doing adult things, and not having restricted clothing or swaddling, being fed and bathed and toilet and everything else according to biological need, but also according to what's going on around the place, instead of a clock-based schedule for this is your bedtime, this is your, you know, all that sort of thing. Those things affect your cognition. And it's not just Aboriginal people. All the studies that have been done on this, more contextual thinking, you know, that's people in Russia, that's people in Scotland, that's people in Korea, still even in the city, because of their grammar. Because in Korean, you have to put the context at the start of the sentence, you know. So there's this different kind of approach to figure and ground. You know, when you look at an image, you know, from an Indigenous thinking point of view, you don't see that the man walking his dog first. You know, you see what time of day it is and what season it is, from where the sun is and where the light's going, where the shadow is, what kind of trees they are, what seasons that is. And like, look, there's a possum back there. You're probably going to be down there, that hole there. And you're looking everywhere, all around. You see everything first. And in all that, there's a fellow walking his dog, you know. But whereas, you know, from a sort of a domesticated human point of view, and that includes a lot of, you know, Aboriginal people today who've, you know, had to be raised up in that. You know, it's not some biological thing. It's, you know, people who are removed, they think like that as well, because they have to. You know, you just look at that picture and go, that's a man walking his dog. Oh, in the forest. You know, and yeah, it's a different kind of cognition, different kind of thinking. I think that's the main thing. Yeah. But there are lots of other things, and I go into sort of, you know, 5 different areas of ways of thinking and making meaning in the world and knowledge production, you know.
So based on that, are you saying that in your mind, nurture has a far greater influence than the nature and biology?
Well, that's another thing. Usually there are no dichotomies. usually anything where there's a forced choice between, one position and another, usually it's a bit of both. And usually when you start looking deeper, it's not just one of those two things either on a continuum. There's usually about a dozen or even 100 different things, variables all contributing. And that's that other aspect of Indigenous inquiry and thinking, is that really holistic cognition, where you're able to see all of those different stories, and that you're able to put together an operating model, a theory based on the aggregate of all those forces, all those stories, all those things interacting together. And that model, that theory that you put together based on all that, has a greater chance of offering you a successful prediction about what's going to happen. So it's really useful in research. I talk about a lot of studies in the book that have been inconclusive, in the scientific method, because they're unable to replicate the results, because they haven't included all the variables. And so I just I suggest that if scientists just include the variables of time and place in a lot of those studies where they can't replicate results, that it would change things a bit. So one of the examples I give is fish oil studies. In one study, it'll show that fish oil has a big effect on the kidneys and actually heals necrotic, really terrible pathologies in the kidneys. And then in the next study, there will be no effect at all, or a terrible effect even, because they're just considering this substance, fish oil, to be a universal thing. And they're not considering place and time. Because, from an Indigenous point of view, we know that the fat in a fish is only medicinal in a certain season, and just for a couple of months. And if you don't get it in that window, then you don't get the medicine. And most people understand this on some level. What's the best medicine for a cold? Your mama told you.
Well, my mama come from Italian heritage, and we would have said a little bit of lemon and some honey in hot water. Yeah.
And chicken broth?
Absolutely. I'm a vegetarian now, so that's a bit more challenging, but yeah.
That's it. But that chicken broth is in, it's only in that season. And it just happens to be that in the flu season, that's when the chicken broth is medicinal. Because in that season, they're not funneling all of their energies into reproductive activity. They're bringing that nutrients in. So chicken is medicinal in that season. We have these symbioses as humans who've been living in a landscape. And Italy, I think, is one of the most resilient countries in terms of connection to landscapes and being shaped culturally by a landscape, no matter what's going on. Oh, we're all fascists now, are we? Yeah, all right. Yeah. Oh, we're Italians. Oh, we're unification of Italy. Yeah, all right. That was only 5 minutes ago, by the way. They're like, oh, we're Italians now, are we? Yeah. I'm Umbrian.
Yeah.
And I'm still going to speak my language, the same way my bioregion tells me to speak it. Yeah, I'll talk Italian if I have to go on the news or go for a job. No worries. But when I'm at home, I'm speaking Umbrian, because that's how we talk here. And that's our regione, that's our region there. And it's defined not by whatever kingdom wants to come in, or invader wants to come in, or political party or government or fascist or anything. No, that region, that border, that's defined by a bioregion, and we're shaped by that. And this is my paese, and it's family first, then it's my village, then it's my country, which is my bioregion. And then I'm Italian. And then I'm European, maybe. But, I'm from here, bros. That's what I like about Italians. That's what I like about the Italian diaspora. They, so you're still coming, you got this, you're still shaped by this extended family kind of ethic and way of relating, in the world. And it's easier to talk to you than it is to talk to people who don't know anything but, have no living memory of a tradition beyond a nuclear family or, a single parent family or something. I just find it easier to talk to fobs.
Yeah.
Frankly.
I think it's interesting from my own sort of Italian perspective. We're from a small village in Italy, and it's
which one?
In
quel paese?
In parli italiano in Calabria in the south. But
hey, that's my favorite, the Mezzogiorno. Yeah.
But using that as the example, they would they have a great connection to the land. They have a great connection to the animals. If an animal is killed, or traditionally, they would eat all of that animal. They would eat all of it. They would make salami with part of it. And then they would take the skin and make a musical instrument with it. And it's very similar to some of these themes that you're discussing. For me, your book, the strongest point that I got was one word: connection. And the opposite of that is disconnection. And I believe that the Indigenous way is a far more connected way of life. My way of life is far more disconnected, and that's to people, that's to the seasons, that's to the land, that's to everything. And that was sort of the strongest point that I got, that if we can become much more connected to the world around us, that ultimately.
When I was a young fella, I think I was 18 or 19, I might have been. I worked my butt off for a year, like washing dishes, whatever I could do, and I got together $2,000, and I went to Italy. And I was working for Calabrians, so and I really loved the dialect there. Anyway, so I had to go to Calabria, and I loved it, and it was wild. And I went hunting there, and I found out that in that tiny peninsula that's smaller than New South Wales, there are more people with hunting licenses in Italy than there are people in Australia altogether. And those old fellas, they were going out on their land that they look after. Most people are in the cities, but out in the countryside, there's stuff going on, and Calabria is wild, and there's fellas walking around with like beautiful shotguns, and I went hunting with them, and we ate this cinghiale, that boar, and the foraging, just do all foraging out, getting mushroom, getting, chestnuts and all kinds of nuts, Oh, look, I love that thing. And as soon as I got back to Australia, of course, I'm just, I just hanging out with lots of Italians all the time. I loved it. I loved the whole Italian thing. It was more familiar to me than anything else around the place.
That's very interesting.
In the settler community. And particularly, like, there's something about Calabrians I just love. So anyway, it's really good to meet you. That's
likewise.
That's why I'm feeling very relaxed with you.
Well, look, on the same way, I mean, I think that this sort of, I hope I'm saying the right word, tribalism, in a sense, is very strong. But to be honest, I mean, none of these systems are perfect. There's a lot of negativity associated with this way of life down in the south of Italy, as well. And sometimes the family front is a front, and what's going on behind the doors is not exactly as peaceful and calm as people would like.
But there's a history. There's history there, and there are a lot of economic pressures and all kinds of things contributing to that. But
can I read you my favourite, or the paragraph that had the most that touched me, had the biggest impression on me from your book? And it's sort of viewing this idea of collective versus individualism. It is difficult to relinquish the illusions of power and delusions of exceptionalism that come with privilege, but it is strangely liberating to realise your status as a single node in a cooperative network. There is honour to be found in this role, and a certain dignified agency. You won't be swallowed up by a hive mind or lose your individuality. You will retain your autonomy while simultaneously being profoundly interdependent and connected. In fact, sustainable systems cannot function without the full autonomy and unique expression of each independent part of the independent whole. That paragraph basically smashed everything that I thought I knew in my 43 years on the planet.
Oh my God.
I mean, the whole concept that within a collective, I can not only be individual, but even be
But
more.
you're required to be, yeah.
Yeah.
The collective loses its health if you're not being your fullest expression of yourself. If you're not asserting your exceptionalism and being all of that. See, it's another one of those forced choices. In these gammon culture wars, we're all forced to choose between rampant individualism on the right and just sort of collective sort of disappearance on the left. We're just going to get subsumed into this big bureaucratic nightmare of collectivism. Or we're just going to be like these lone wolves running around, bloody, just destroying the entire planet. That's your only choices, people. Pick one. It's terrible. So anytime you've got a forced choice, usually it's like, no, it'll be a bit of both. And then once you figure out how to, live that entire continuum and to be in the tension and balance of that as an expression of yourself, then start looking out and noticing all the other things that are coming in and intersecting with that, because it's seldom a binary. There is no such thing as binaries. That's a logic that we've been fooled into, and particularly since these devices started, because everything's a yes or no choice. If you want to use an app, it's like, well, do you agree to terms and conditions that you haven't read? Yes or no. It's binary, even code. It's a 1 or a damn 0. But that's what makes computing stupid and limited. That's why we haven't really improved, the tech really in 30 years. I mean, it looks sexier and goes a bit faster, but that's about it.
Yeah.
But, quantum computing sort of goes, look, basically we're doing all these zeros and ones with frickin' electrons, right? We're shooting some light at some electrons, making them behave in a certain way, and we're telling them, hey, you're a 1. And then we're telling another electron, hey, you're a 0. And then we string them together, and that's a bit. But in quantum computing, you've got qubits, which is recognizing that, well, what the fuck? An electron can be two things at once. An electron can be sitting in your butt cheek and then ping up to Mars or Pleiades or somewhere and then ping back, in a split second. It can be anywhere and it can be anything. So therefore, in quantum computing, we can just adjust the light a little bit and say to the electron, hey, you're a 0, but hey, guess what? You're also a 1. Is that okay? All right, good. Next one. And then so they make qubits like that. So binary logic doesn't work. Not on the quantum level, not for optimal tech, certainly not for optimal relationships, and above all, not for any kind of sense making in this world. If we're expected to make sense with all these forced little choices and joining our little shitty tribes and, having to subscribe to one ideology and everything that goes with that, and then purity testing and policing that into insanity and infinity, then we're all dead. No more forced choices. No more forced choices. Yeah. You don't have to choose between individualism and collectivism.
So from
Do the lot.
From this Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspective, is your idea or your thought that they can coexist together, or that the thinking must combine we require a new way of thinking, which is not coexistence, but a mesh of Indigenous and non-Indigenous?
Yeah, it's a kind of a plurality, but even that reconciling idea sounds lovely, and there's that ancient and new together, that juxtaposition, sexy, and that's kind of where all the cutting edge thinking is now. But hey, we can't just look now. We've got to look. What's the next thing? And the next thing, we need to start thinking. Well, Indigenous is what every human being is born as before we wreck them. You know, so we have to start thinking about a right of return, this absolute emergency where we need to bring everybody on the planet back under the law of the land, and we need to do it soon, or everything and everyone's going to die. So what use even is a binary of Indigenous and non-Indigenous? I don't like the idea of having to define myself in relation to a colony in order to have an identity. And that makes my identity almost unknowable to most people. Even in my own community, most people are defining themselves in relation to the colony. So I am not that. And then the colony is looking back and saying, well, we're not that. We're non-Indigenous, you know? And so we have these struggles like going, well, even, so modernism and then postmodernism, which is basically just not modernism. Does it say what it is? Not really, but it certainly says what it's not. So, I mean, everybody's defining themselves as, well, we're not them.
Yep.
But no one's really looking and saying, well, what are we? But so most of the old fellas that sort of guide me in my life, they don't think like that. They're not binary. And they don't think of themselves as something that's in relation or subjugation or anything, to a colony. They're just still what they've always been and what they always will be. And I strive for that in my life. Yeah. And I know I've got my own path to that, which is sort of tricksy and all that kind of thing. But yeah, I really try to just smash those binaries, and I just refuse to define myself in comparison to others. I define myself in relation to others, by my relationships and my web of relationships. Not whether I'm more this than that person or less that than that person. How well I fit with the definition from this dominant culture or, that foreign culture who's looking over here to try and see the exotic Aborigine. And they're usually really disappointed when they meet me and they find I don't have a bone through my nose and standing on one leg, etc. All of these things are just ephemera and just kind of just cloaking. And I just don't have time for them.
I wanted to just finish with the way that you finished the book, actually. And you talk about an appropriate way of coming to Indigenous knowledge and working towards sustainable solutions. And you use the words respect, connect, reflect, direct, or in your words, spirit, heart, head, and hands. For us watching and listening to this, what is the thought behind those terms?
Yeah. Well, that respect, connect, reflect, direct, that was Mama Doris Shillingsworth. That's her, she invented that. We spent a long time just trying to figure out what this process, a respectful process of Indigenous knowledge production was. And we ended up with that it was always those 4 steps. Starting with respect. And she says that non-Aboriginal people coming into our communities always do it the other way around. They come in and they direct change, and then, they don't meet all their outcomes and KPIs. So they stop and reflect, and they do get their measuring tools out and try to figure out what went wrong. Reflect, and then they realize, well, we needed to build relationships first. And so then they connect, they have a barbecue, or they try to connect. They have a barbecue usually and invite the elders, and some come along. And then just before they leave, they sort of discover this respect. And then they sort of fly out going, oh, we'll never forget you. I've learned so much from you. It's like, oh, thanks. If you ever want to return the favor, like try and do things the other way around. Respect, connect, reflect, direct. Anyway, that's her thing. Yeah, her son died a couple of days ago. Yeah, so we're really struggling to raise the money for that funeral for that right now. Yeah, but that was her thing, and she's just an amazing lady. So I'm trying to get a lot of people to try and support her and send her money so that she can grieve in peace at the moment. Yeah.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry for that. Not easy times for anyone.
Yeah, that's true.
And so in that, that was her interpretation, and you interpreted that as spirit, heart, head, and hand.
Yeah, and I think a lot of different people have their own way of looking at it. You know, some people were describing it as roots, trunk, branches, and leaves. You know, yeah. It's that. Yeah, there are a lot of ways of looking at it, and a lot of layers to it. You know, a lot of people are using that as a methodology or a process, and are working with it in that way. You know, like as a structure for their research or their project, and some people are experimenting with it as a structure for like organizational change and stuff like that. And all around the world, people are doing interesting things with that framework, and I guess many other bits and pieces of story from that book. I had a climate scientist contact me and say she's been sitting on all this data for like 5 years, but she couldn't figure out how to model it. She couldn't figure out how to model that data appropriately and then share it with people. And after she read my book, you know, she went to sleep and then woke up and the solution was there in her head, you know. And there's been, like, once a week, I get a story like that from somebody, you know, from economists, from, you know, people who are doing all kinds of really amazing, very complex scientific work, and they've been stuck on a problem. And then they've read the book and they've found the solution in there, you know, which is, it's weird, isn't it?
Do you know what's going on?
I still always bring it back to Juma's ritual magic. I think that's just working. That's working big, complex, emergent, you know, magics in the world that I can't even comprehend. And I don't even want to. Yeah. I'm happy to just sit back and watch it happen. Yeah.
That's a beautiful way to finish up. I think let's leave it with magic, and again, your book touched me a lot. I'll leave some links below the chat where people can grab the book. I imagine it's available in all the good bookshops. And
no worries.
Thanks, mate. I know your time is like diamonds these days, so very much appreciate it, and best of luck with the book, and look forward to the next one.
Good luck with your vegetarianism.
I'm a year in and it's going all right. Thanks, brother.
There's an old Calabrian saying, if you got an eggplant, you got a meal. So you'll do all right.
Beautiful.
Okay. See ya.
Love
Bye.
it. Thanks, Tyson. Ciao. Many thanks for watching. I'd love for you to be notified of new episodes, so subscribe and hit the bell button below. Like and share this video, and feel free to leave any comments or questions below. You can also visit liminalspace.earth to discover all episodes. But for now, many thanks again, and I'll see you next time in a liminal space.